Hello my dears, today we are going to get a little technical because I don't know about you, but I had no idea what my legal rights as a disabled person are. And Tuesday is the 31st anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and we're also going to talk about the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, because that is just as, if not more important, and it's now part of the ADA. Honestly, we're probably going to talk about the IDEA more than the ADA because I get really passionate about education, so we'll see how it goes. But before 1975, disabled children were often either homeschooled or sent to live in institutions. There were also specific residential schools for the deaf and for the blind, where they could build community with other people like them and learn the skills that they needed for the world. Now, schools for the deaf specifically used only sign language for a good portion of their history, but then, due to some stupid laws, had to stop using ASL in the majority of schools and only teaches students how to speak and listen and lip read. For about 100 years, and it's still happening today, so please be sufficiently mad about that. Thank you. So in 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, was passed, and it did two major things. It guaranteed all handicapped children ages 3 to 21, or preschool through grade 12, a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And it mandated that every such child have an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. Super great things, right? It means that all disabled children could go to school and that they can have an education plan in that school specific for their learning needs. And this effectively ended institutionalization, sort of. It's still alive and well today in its own way, which we will get into at some point, but it was a major shift in closing many non-educational institutions where children were just kept for their whole lives, and it gave all children access to education in the least restrictive environment. Now let's talk about that phrasing really quick, and it's been a huge argument, the least restrictive environment. Now you would think for the deaf and blind children that the least restrictive environment for them would be their prospective residential schools, right? And then all of the disabled kids would, well, what's their least restricted environment? And this is where the problem of mainstreaming comes in. Do you put a disabled child with the other children even though they learn differently and need their own accommodations? Or do you put them in a separate classroom where they can learn the way that they learn? Well, for deaf and blind kids, their residential schools were effectively seen as institutions and then put at the bottom of the placement hierarchy for education. They didn't close, many of them are around today, but there's less, and they have much smaller populations than they used to. And now, over half of schools with deaf children only have one student, so they don't have access to the signing community. The interpreters used in these schools tend to not be so great because there's issues with certification, and they spend much of the day by themselves in a classroom with an interpreter or a teacher, and the social skills that you learn through other things in school are just completely lost from their education. Is that the least restrictive environment? And mainstreaming with autistic children and children with other disabilities is only a small bit less isolating, mainly because, well, they can hear, but many programs still have them spending most of their days alone or with just a handful of other students rather than with the rest of their class. And when they are with the rest of the class, the social barriers they face can be enormous. For some people, muddling through the public school system with an IEP is good enough, but think about all the possibilities of a different education system where kids don't have to muddle and could instead just learn the way that they needed to with other people like them. There's a school that has done just that in the UK called the Limpsfield Grange School, which is entirely autistic girls, and I will include some links about it below. But honestly, it looks like a dream because they're taught the way that they need to be taught with other people who don't think that they're weird or wrong or different. They just are. And before you say, but that doesn't prepare them for the real world because the real world isn't all accepting, I need you to take a moment to realize the importance of growing up in a place that is all accepting. Instead of a place where you're bullied and ridiculed every single day for 12 years straight, which one of those situations do you think would better prepare you for the future? As somebody who has spent half her education in co-ed schools and the other half in historically girls' schools and women's colleges, I can confidently tell you that the latter has taught me so much more and made me so much more confident and overall a better person than being in a co-ed institution. The sun just got dark. Anyway, at the same time, the idea of segregating people by disability is tricky, not only because segregation is generally an issue, and it's against federal law according to the ADA, which we'll get to in a bit, but also because think of the amount of undiagnosed autistic children who are now stuck between. And for the non-disabled neurotypicals, they wouldn't realize that other people like them exist because of their privilege. It's kind of like the argument for having girls' schools, but getting rid of boys' schools altogether because they aren't a minority. And ideally, we wouldn't need to do any of this. Everything would just be accessible and equal, and mainstreaming would work just fine. But right now, it's really failing a huge portion of the population and leaving people undereducated. So as much as the IDEA gave us a bunch of rights, it also took away some others, and there is still so much work to be done within the field of disabled education. So there's that lovely law. The second one, which was passed in 1990, is the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I will include a lovely resource in the description that I found that goes through the entire act in more understandable, accessible language, including the IDEA, which you should really check out. But basically, the ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against disabled people. That includes employers, which we'll get to in a bit, as well as civil rights for incarcerated disabled people and the Fair Housing Act. It also requires physical accessibility and the prohibition of segregation in government buildings, polling places, public transport, airplanes, businesses, commercial facilities, warehouses for example, and public accommodations, which include restaurants, retail stores, hotels, movie theaters, private schools, though mine wasn't accessible, convention centers, doctors' offices, homeless shelters, transportation depots, zoos, funeral homes, daycare centers, and recreation facilities, including sports stadiums and fitness clubs. So basically everywhere. And this also includes access to teletypewriters and telecommunication relay services, which are how the deaf use phones, over all telephone services available 24/7, as well as closed captioning. It also means that the government is required to give us an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities, for example, public education, employment, transportation, recreation, healthcare, social services, insurance, courts, voting, and town meetings. The ADA also includes an updated version of the IDEA, which we did talk about earlier, so you can see that within the legislation. And then there is the employer section, which we're going to go into. So the ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of employment for any company with 15 or more employees. Once hired, employers are required to make reasonable accommodations to enable that person to do the essential functions of their jobs, such as making a table shorter for someone in a wheelchair or giving extra time for work. These accommodations cannot cause undue hardship on the operation of the organization. I'm not quite sure how that is defined, so if you know, please let me know. And for non-visible disabilities, employers have the right to require documentation from a medical or healthcare provider. All they need is a letter stating your disability and how it may limit you. The majority of the sources that I looked at mentioned very aggressively that you should never, ever, ever, under any circumstance, sign any forms provided by your employer to release your medical information. You probably knew that, but I just wanted to put it out there. Don't do that. Your employer is also not allowed to tell other people what your disability is or discuss your particular accommodations with other workers. They can only identify what those accommodations are and how they can be implemented. And there you go. As far as I can tell, as a non-law person reading a very long law, those are your rights as a disabled person. And now it's important to remember that just because they are your legal rights doesn't mean that they always happen, because discrimination may be illegal, but it sure is still a thing. But with the exception of the messiness of the education system, the ADA did make a huge difference, and it's a big deal. It's still a big deal, and we can thank it for so much. Yes, we have a long way to go, but it was a big step, and 31 years later, it's still just as big a deal. Anyway, I hope that you learned a thing, because I sure did learn many a thing. Let me know your opinions about the education conundrum. I would love to hear about them and hear about your experiences in the educational system, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.